Well, hi there. Welcome to the Constitution Study. My name is Paul Engel, and I am so glad you could come and join me today. I'm glad you're interested in the Constitution and what we're doing, how I'm doing on the book, and what ideas are rummaging around in my head about the Constitution and everyday life. You know, this is a place where we come to restore the Constitution to we the people. And I want to talk a little bit about that tagline. But first, if this is the first time you've come to the podcast, the first episode you're listening to, thank you very much. I'm glad you're willing to give it a try. I hope you'll find it interesting, educational, occasionally funny. I hope you'll enjoy the time you've dedicated to this. And I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Constitution Study podcast on Apple Podcasts. And if you're returning, if this is you become a regular here, thank you very, very much. It's that type. It's that dedication, that willingness to invest that will help return the Constitution to we the people, that will keep this country free. As I've mentioned, that tagline, returning the Constitution to we the people, that's been on top of my mind lately. And, I wanted to explain where it comes from. You see, the beginning of the Constitution, in the preamble, you've got those three big words, we the people. The idea that this country, this nation, this organization is created by we the people, the people of the United States. It's funny, those three words are used everywhere. They even appear in an episode of the original Star Trek series, because they are so important. But we've lost that. We seem to have turned the Constitution over to a group of 9 high priests in black robes that we call the Supreme Court. We've lost this idea that it's our Constitution. It's not the government's Constitution. It's not to be held, ruled over by 9 people in black robes and their acolytes that are, that are the judges and the lawyers. No, the Constitution is ours. It says so right at the very beginning. And it's important we get back to that idea. Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power." That's what this study is about. It's recognizing that the safe place for the powers of America are the people, and that though we have lost the education, we are no longer, as a group, enlightened enough to exercise that control. The answer we keep hearing is to take it away from us, take away our right to decide for ourselves. We will be told what type of health care we need, what type of car we need to drive, take your pick, how we should build our homes, what we're allowed to do with our land. No, it is to educate ourselves. And that's what this is all about. Let's read and study the Constitution. Let's know what it says so we can take it back to we the people, so that we can exercise that authority and do it in an intelligent, rational, and enlightened way. So that's kind of my rant for the session. What I want to talk to you today about is this idea of unalienable rights. As I've mentioned, I've been working on the Declaration of Independence part of my book, The Constitution Study, and this idea of unalienable rights keeps coming up. And interestingly enough, it's not just in reading this. I've had several discussions and interactions with people where they talk about rights, and it shows me a serious lack of understanding. So I thought I would take some time and talk to you about what is an unalienable right. See, the Constitution says that we are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what is an unalienable right? Well, we hear a lot about gay rights and transgendered rights and minority rights and women's rights and this right and that right. People talk about a right to housing, to health care, to education, to a living wage. It seems today Anything somebody wants suddenly becomes a right. Kind of reminds me of a quote from The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. So let's define an unalienable right. Right? It is something that you have inherently, just because you are. It is not given to you by anybody. It cannot be taken away by anybody. See, whether you believe in the God of the Bible, Allah, Buddha, or chance, all human beings are endowed with certain rights. They cannot be taken away. Oh, sure, they can be infringed, they can be restricted, they can be declared illegal, but you still have them. And the proof of that is, look at what happens in a country where these rights are restricted. How many people look to find ways to exercise those rights, even if they're illegal? We kind of lose the perspective of the roughly 10,000 years of recorded history. It's only been the last few hundred that we've had truly free people, where we've had these rights that were recognized and protected. There were little hiccups and blips throughout history, and I'm not a historian. I think about the Greeks and the Spartans having some forms of democracy, but this recognition that as a human being, you have a right. You have a series of rights that cannot be taken away. Now, the other aspect of these unalienable rights, which I think is often lost, is that a right can be exercised without infringing on the rights of others. Now you may say, wait, where does the Declaration say that an unalienable right can be exercised without infringing on the rights of others? Well, the Declaration says all men are created equal. Now, understand, yes, throughout history, we have not treated men equally, but it's the recognition that all men are created equal. See, if you can exercise a quote-unquote right by restricting mine, then your rights are more important than mine, and we are not equal. So if we're all to be equal, then your exercising of rights cannot infringe on my exercise of my rights. A couple of examples. The Bill of Rights lists the freedom of speech and press. And by the way, extra points if you didn't have to look up to see which amendment those are recorded in. But it says, yes, you have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. In other words, you can express yourself however you see fit, and I can express myself however I see fit. Now, to exercise that right legitimately, I have to do so without infringing on the rights of others. The classic example, the one everybody I hear talk about, they say, you can't yell fire in a public theater. Right? The problem is, yes, I can cry fire in a public theater. That is my right. However, if there's no fire, then I have infringed on the rights of others. That would be an illegitimate use of my right. Now, I often hear people talk about the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court ruled that yelling fire in a crowded theater was not covered by the First Amendment. But that's not quite true. See, the case they're talking about is Schneck versus United States, and it had absolutely nothing to do with either fire or theaters. It had to do with a question of, did Congress, through the Espionage Act, have the power to punish Schneck for encouraging men called to military service to dodge the draft? Now, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes used as an example, quote, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic," close quote. Not that you cannot falsely yell fire in a theater, but that you cannot use your First Amendment right as a defense. Then in 1969, the Supreme Court opinion in the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, they said that a law that to punish someone for advocacy or assembly with the purpose to advocate or assemble against an action was contrary to the First and 14th Amendments. In other words, these two opinions both confirm that I can exercise my rights, and I can exercise my right to free speech however I see fit, but I may be held accountable if doing so harms others, directly infringes on their rights. We see similar situations with freedom of the press where you're allowed to print whatever you want. We often hear about freedom of the press and the Fourth Estate, and yes, the press has tremendous protections. However, the press cannot knowingly lie. There are libel laws and defamation laws because that would be the illegitimate use of the freedom of the press to lie about or defame another person. Let's look at another example. How about property rights? Interestingly enough, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was originally life, liberty, and property. Property was changed to the idea of pursuit of happiness, and it's interesting that even today we think of the American dream as owning a home and a car and other stuff. It's owning property. And property rights is a basic idea that I have a right to control what I own. See, we think of the property right as simply the ability to obtain and keep land, but it's so much more. See, what good is a right to own a thing if I can't control what happens to that thing? You see, property rights are also unalienable. Someone cannot legitimately tell me what to do with what I own. I own my home and the land it sits on. I decide whether or not I want others to hunt, fish, or bring firearms onto my property, or any business I might own. Now, I've heard people say their Second Amendment right trumps my private property rights, that they can bring their guns onto private property because they have the Second Amendment right. But again, they have the right to keep and bear arms, but to do so infringing other people's property rights would be an illegitimate use of that right. You can keep and bear arms as long as you don't violate others' rights, such as those of life, liberty, and property. See, that's why this whole discussion about gun control gets everything backwards. I have a right to keep and bear arms until I use that arm to deprive somebody of their life, of their liberty, or of their property, or any other of their unalienable rights. But rather than protecting those rights, they do so by trying to infringe my rights. Now let's have a little fun. Let's look at some of the rights we hear talked about so much today and see if they are legitimate. See, we often hear about the right to not be offended. Colleges have safe spaces where people can go. Colleges actually have quote-unquote free speech zones, places where only in that spot of the college are you allowed to exercise your right to free speech. Personally, I think that's nuts. But we hear people all the time claim they have a right to not be offended. People ask for monuments to be taken down because it offends them and they don't want to see it. People ask for books to be removed because it offends them and they don't want to see it. People want to boycott other businesses because what they've done offends them and they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to see it. This is not only wrong, it's impossible to have a right to not be offended. Why? Because the only way to ensure someone's right to not be offended is to suppress other people's right to free speech and press. If you pay attention, you'll notice that every time someone claims a right to not be offended, they are using it to suppress the free speech or press rights of someone else. Look at the people who go to colleges and students say, I have my free speech rights to protest. Yes, until you infringe on the free speech rights of others. Or what about the people who have come to the event that wish to hear the speaker? What about their rights? See, today it's like my rights exist for me, but we forget all about the rights of somebody else. I'm old enough to remember the saying, I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death your right to say it. Where has that gone? And in fact, the First Amendment specifically prevents the passing of laws to avoid offending others. Where does it say that, you ask? Well, speech that people agree with does not need to be protected. And that's kind of obvious, right? If all we spoke about didn't bother anybody, there'd be no need to protect that. Only speech that offends others needs to be protected. Let's face it, you cannot exist in this world without offending people. Your ideas offend others. I had an online discussion with an old acquaintance of mine, and he got all bent out of shape and thought people should not be allowed to vote because their opinions about things offended him. Now, that's not the way he put it, but that's the effect of what it was. He didn't like what was being said, so he wanted to deny their right to say it. The First Amendment protects my right to say or write what I want, whether it offends somebody or not. And if somebody says something that offends me, I should be grown up enough to deal with it. If somebody writes something that offends me, I should be grown up enough to deal with it. We all need to put on big boy pants, big girl pants, grow up and understand people are going to say things you don't like. Grow up and deal with it. Stop being an infant. Stop being a child. Grow up and deal with it. But if the right to not be offended is not a legitimate right, in fact, it isn't. But what about the so-called right to education or health care? Now, health care is relatively new, but the quote-unquote right to education, that one's been around for a while. See, there's a problem, though. The only way someone could exercise a right like this is to force others, educators and healthcare workers, to work for free. Wait, why would they have to work for free, you ask? Well, simple. If it's your right, you deserve it, whether you can pay for it or not. And if you're getting something that you're not paying for, then it's free, right? They'd have to work for free to give you the health care and education that you so richly deserve, right? And let's not forget about the people who build the schools and the hospitals. They'd have to work for free too. Of course, then you've got the people who provide the oil and the gas and the electricity to those buildings. Are they going to work for free? How about the people who write the textbooks or make the medical equipment? Do you expect all of these people to work for free as well? Oh, and don't forget, you need resources. You need paper and ink and plastics and other stuff to make the books and the medical equipment. Do you expect all those to be provided free of charge? Are we going to force people to do these jobs because it's our right? And by the way, that was scare quotes, right. Do you know what they call people who work for free and have no choice about where they work? Yeah, we call them slaves. Think about that for a second. When someone is saying they have a right to education, to healthcare, or any other commodity that requires the input of others, in order to provide that for free, they must work for free. You are enslaving other people. Now, I'm sure there's a whole group of people that are going to go absolutely crazy that I use the word slavery in referring to the indentured servitude of one group of people over another. But that is the only way to get what they're asking for. But you say, they don't have to work for free. We'll just tax people to pay for it. What right do you have to take other people's stuff? I like, there's a gentleman online called Jason Stapleton. I like his line. We don't hurt people and we don't take their stuff. See, tax revenues don't materialize out of thin air. They are taken under the threat of punishment backed up by arms. Do you know what you call people who take what they want by force or intimidation? Yeah, you call that a gang, or you call it the mob. See, if we stop and look rationally at what's being asked, we see most of what we hear about today, termed as rights, are little more than trying to justify greed and gangland behavior. I want to take your money so that I can pay for quote-unquote free education, quote-unquote free health care, or to provide for others. This isn't freedom. This isn't liberty. This is tyranny. This is what has been lost in America, not simply because there are people that want this, but there are a significant percentage of Americans who are asking our government to be gangs, to be the mob, to be the mafiosa, to intimidate, bully, require people to pay for other people's stuff, to infringe on people's rights in the name of protecting the quote-unquote rights of others. And we've become so disconnected from our Constitution, we don't see it, we don't recognize it, and we have absolutely no idea how to fix it. Now, I've been talking for a while, so I think I'm going to stop there, but I do want you to stop and think about this as you listen to the news or you hear what's going on around you. Is what's being called a right legitimately a right? Is what's being asked of us legitimately something that is owed, that we owe? Are our taxes being used for legitimate purposes? Are what the government is providing a legitimate use, or is it an infringement on somebody's rights? And are you concerned enough about everybody else's rights as you are about your own? Because one day they will come after your rights. Sure, you're going to have them go after somebody else's rights, but eventually they're going to come after your own. So I want to thank you. I hope you found this interesting. It's, as you may know, it's something I get a little passionate about, a little excited about, because I think it is the bedrock of understanding the Constitution, how our governments are supposed to work, and in restoring the Constitution to we the people. I hope you'll go and visit constitutionstudy.com. I have several articles that you may find interesting around this topic. Please join the mailing list. I'm getting close to releasing my essay on the 16th and 17th Amendment. It's got a very provocative title, How the 16th and 17th Amendment Destroyed the Republic. I think you'll find that interesting. Most of all, please ask a question. Under the podcast, you'll see an option to ask a question. Please do. I'm looking for questions that I can answer both on the webpage and on the podcast, because I want to get an idea of where your minds are at. Do you think I'm on the right track? Do you think I've got something wrong? Do you not understand something that I'm explaining here? So I want to thank you for your time. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you will come back to the Constitution study, come back to the podcast, come back to the website. Most of all, let us continue to work to restore the Constitution to its rightful owners, we, the people of the United States of America. And may God bless us, the people of the United States of America. Thank you.